Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome AERA's President, Carol Lee.
I have a bit of the sniffles, so I hope that I won't start hawking up here, but we will do the best that we can. I want to welcome the many people who have come tonight. I'd like to recognize first the amazing staff of the association who worked tirelessly to bring this event into being and have done so beautifully each year. Felice Levine, our executive director, I'm going to stand. Phoebe Stevenson, our deputy executive director. Jerry Strout, director of government relations. Helene Patterson, director of Jerry is director of government relations. Helene is director of public relations, and the rest of our fine staff who are here. This is an enormous event to put on, and for those of you who've been here in prior years, you can see that the staff do an absolutely wonderful job in putting this together. I'd also like to recognize the members of the AERA Council who represent the leadership of the organization. AERA Council members are here. You want to raise your hand and let people know you're in the house? And we're also delighted that our sister organization, the National Academy of Education, has decided to meet here in Washington, D.C. this year in order to attend the Brown Lecture. And there are also a number of prior presidents who are here. Linda Darling Hammond, Lorraine McDonald, Catherine Snow, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Laurie Shepard. We very much appreciate the continuity of your support for AERA in this magnificent event. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 7th Annual Brown Lecture. This lecture was inaugurated by the association in 2004 on the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. The Brown decision has represented a watershed in legal precedent in terms of equity and opportunity to learn within the United States, and has served as a catalyst for later legislation to address the myriad ways in which equity in educational outcomes remains problematic for us. AERA celebrates this historic precedent, both because of its historical significance, but also because it illustrates the role that research in education, in learning and development, in public policy can play in shaping policy that can affect the quality of life for our citizens, particularly for our young people. We continue today to wrestle with the underlying logic of some of the theoretical assumptions that were drawn on in the Brown case. For example, Margaret Beale Spencer's 2007 Brown address, as well as the political complexities that it embodies. For example, in Gloria Ladson-Billings' DeWitt Wallace lecture in 2004 entitled "The Price We Paid for Brown." The presentations in this annual distinguished lecture have examined the continued impact of structural discrimination on life course outcomes and have challenged us as educators, as researchers, indeed as citizens, to work to create a just society for all, where opportunity to learn is not constrained by race, ethnicity, class, gender, disability, or sexual orientation. Indeed, this is the legacy of Brown, embodying a people's will to struggle for freedom and the resiliency of our structure of government to respond so that we may achieve, to continue to struggle to achieve, that basic goal of the founding of our nation. As educators and researchers, we have important roles to play in this ongoing human struggle. We have tonight, as part of the activities of this lecture, a kind of visual retrospective to try to place in historical context the significance of the Brown decision, its impact on children, what life was like in education in the pre-Brown decision. And we have also each year some wonderful musicians who come to accompany that presentation. This year, we have a young man on the stage. His name is Clifton Williams. He's a senior at Washington, D.C.'s Duke Ellington School of the Arts. He is a young artist. He won the Young Artist Scholarship from the Jack Kent Cook Foundation, which partners with the National Public Radio's From the Top program to support exceptionally promising student musicians from low-income communities to achieve their potential. I was just talking with Clifton in the green room, and he was indicating that his application's in now for conservatory. He's a musician, a senior, and so any of you who have some connections for Juilliard and such places, you should make sure that you come and speak with him. And we'd also like to recognize Rory Pullins, who's the head of Duke Ellington School of the Arts, and his wife, certainly as the educators who've helped to shape the wonderful route of development that this talented young musician has. So with that, we would like to welcome you to a retrospect on Brown versus Board of Education. This young man represents the reason that we do what we do. We are in a long-distance race. The story from Mendez to Brown indicates it's a long-distance race, and that we are in each generation, the baton is passed on to us. And we receive that baton as human beings. We receive it as citizens. We receive it as educators. We receive it as researchers. We receive it as policymakers. And the consequences of what we do are tremendously, tremendously important. The Brown Lecture is an honored lectureship within the American Educational Research Association. There is a very rigorous process, selection process, that will be described to you shortly by Chris Gutierrez, who is the president-elect of the American Educational Research Association. She was also, at the time of the selection committee, the chair of the Social Justice Action Committee, which spearheads the selection process. Chris Gutierrez is the professor and provost chair in the School of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder. She was for many years at UCLA. Chris was a winner in 2004 of the Scribner Award from AERA. In 2007, winner of the Scholars of Color Award from AERA. Her parents were delighted to find out that she was selected to be one of the 100 most influential Hispanics in the United States. And she was also a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study for Behavioral Sciences. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce Chris Gutierrez, who will introduce our honored speaker, Louis Small.
Buenas noches. Or as we say in my little mining town in Miami, Arizona, bienvenidos al Brown Lecture. We excel in hybrid language practices. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would first like to acknowledge the work of the 2009 Brown Lecture Committee, responsible for the selection of our esteemed colleague, Louis Small. The committee included 3 members of the Social Justice Action Committee, Zenaida Aguirre Munoz, James Earl Davis, and myself, who also had the pleasure of chairing this committee. The committee also included Lorraine McDonald as president of AERA, Carol Lee, president-elect, and of course now president of AERA, Felice Levine, executive director of AERA, and George Wimberly, AERA director of Social Justice and Professional Development. Thank you, colleagues, for your excellent choice of Professor Louis Small to deliver the 6th Annual Brown Lecture in Education Research. I have the privilege of introducing Professor Louis Small to you, even though his work is among the most widely used scholarship in education, the learning sciences, and anthropology of education, for example. Professor Moll's exemplary body of work and his commitment to use social science research to advance our understandings of the instrumental and mediational role of culture that culture plays in the learning processes has helped to challenge the reductionist tendencies that characterizes working class schooling, as well as narrow conceptions of Latino and immigrant communities, their language, and other cultural practices. Inspired by Vygotsky and cultural historical approaches to learning and development, Professor Moll has advanced approaches that remind educational researchers that culture cannot be studied directly. Instead, Moll's scholarly work has directed us to study how people live culturally, that is, their cultural practices. Culture, in this sense, is a verb and directs our attention to people's participation in the everyday and valued practices of their communities. The most well-known work in this domain is his work with colleagues Norma Gonzalez and others that proffers a pedagogy that builds on and extends the cultural resources of immediate school communities by making strategic connections with local households and what they call funds of knowledge. That is, the repertoires of practice and networks of expertise and exchange that serve as resources for negotiating and navigating everyday life. It is this and other work on the cultural mediation of thinking that best exemplifies his significant contribution to educational research, policy, and practice. In one of my favorite Mole articles entitled Turning to the World, he, like Vygotsky earlier, illustrates the significance of the social in things as well as in people. He wrote that, quote, "The world in which we live in is humanized, full of material and symbolic objects that are culturally constructed, historical in origin, and social in context." Now, following the cultural historical tradition, allow me to rise to the concrete and share an exemplary passage from his work in which he details a day in the life in the Mole household to illustrate how everyday life is saturated with and mediated by cultural artifacts. I share excerpts from his account. He writes, "You are asleep in your room, your spouse, partner, lover, etc. is sleeping next to you, as is your custom. Before you went to sleep close to midnight as usual, you noticed that the weather forecaster on television predicted an unusually cold night, so you adjusted the thermostat in your home accordingly, so that even if it gets cold outside, it will be comfortable in your room. The alarm goes off, which you have tuned to NPR. You lean over to your night table, turn off the radio, and glance at the time of the clock, but you can't see it. The numbers are too blurry. You are nearsighted. A problem that has nothing to do, of course, with your age, but it might be inherited from your parents. So you put on your glasses, modify your vision, and glance again at the clock. It's 5 a.m. Now, if you're male and Latino like me," he continues, "you're probably going to go fix breakfast for your spouse, who is still asleep, so that when she rises, her nourishment is ready to be consumed." And he says, "I like to challenge cultural models." And then he writes about going and finding the newspaper and then cursing in 2 languages about an article that has irritated him. And then he details the exquisite way he prepares the special egg breakfast for his wife. And then he says, "You turn the natural, the eggs, into the cultural, the special recipe, and get ready to awaken your spouse. Breakfast is ready, mi amor," you call out in an affectionate code switch. This descriptive account of one day in the life of Louis Mole captures his work on the socially, culturally mediated nature of human activity. However, there's one aspect of this account with which I would like to quibble. I happen to know his wife, Anna. So I have it on good authority that his claim that making breakfast for his amor is a cultural practice in the Mole household is suspect at best. Thanks for that information, Anna. This slight exaggeration aside, Louis Mole's work has demonstrated that high standards of inquiry and advocating for high standards and a robust and equitable educational system for all students are not incompatible. His attention to producing ethical, consequential, and theoretically rigorous work has earned him continuous recognition by his peers. Although his accomplishments are too numerous to mention here, I would like to highlight just a few. He was elected member of the National Academy of Education, one of the first Latinos to earn this distinction. In 2005, he received the Division C Scribner Award for his contribution to the field of learning and instruction, and the Journal of Latinos in Education Henry T. Trevo Lifetime Achievement Award. In 1999, he was invited to present the AERA Distinguished Lecture. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention his participation in his early years as a fellow at the Rockefeller Center with Sylvia Scribner, Mike Cole, and Ray McDermott, and later his work with Mike Cole at the Laboratory for Comparative Human Cognition. His current work, a longitudinal study of children's biliteracy development and language ideologies that mediate that development, once again reflect a research agenda that squarely addresses an issue of high social, intellectual, and academic significance. I am certain that his lecture tonight, Mobilizing Culture, Language, and Educational Practices, Fulfilling the Promises of Mendes and Brown, will illustrate that ensuring an equitable and robust education for poor children and children from non-dominant communities remains an enduring educational and civil rights problem in the U.S. Please welcome Professor Luis Moll.
Thank you. I can't believe you didn't believe that anecdote. It's true, isn't it, Anna? Where are you? Huh? It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for being here tonight. Let me, if you allow me, please, some acknowledgments. First of all, I want to thank the selection committee that Chris chaired for the ARA Brown Lecture for selecting me to present today. I'm truly honored to be here with you. And in particular, I would like to thank Carol Lee and Chris Gutierrez, who are President and President-elect, respectively, of AARA, Felice Levine, the Executive Director, Elaine Patterson, the Director of Communications and Outreach, and your staff, Elaine, who has been wonderful, for their patience and assistance with me. I truly appreciate it. And I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the person who spearheaded the first Brown Lecture, which took place about 6 years ago at Howard University. And that is my colleague, Richard Ruiz, from the University of Arizona. Where are you, Rich? Thank you, man. Special thanks to Clifton Williams for his talent. Truly appreciated. And also thanks to our interpreters, Bethany and Julie, for being here tonight. Before I begin, also allow me to thank some colleagues that traveled a long distance to be at this event. The Dean of the College of Education at the University of Arizona, Ron Marks, and also Associate Deans Jeffrey Milam and Renette Clift are here with us. Thank you, colleagues, for traveling here tonight. I also want to thank my colleague from the University of Arizona, Julio Camarota, whose work I'll be spotlighting later on, for making the trip to attend the event as well. Thank you, Julio. And special thanks to my doctoral student and colleagues, Karen Spear-Ellingwood, for her invaluable help with the PowerPoint presentation that you're about to witness. Karen is also a lawyer, so I extend my thanks for our many discussions about the Mendez case. Karen created sort of a zone of proximal development for me with the law. Thank you, Karen, and she's here tonight. Thank you, Karen, for coming. I also want to thank my youngest son, Eric, who took a break from his studies at the law school at Syracuse University to attend today. Erico, gracias. And my oldest son, Carlos, who's unable to attend tonight, but I want to let him know I'm thinking about him. And my wife, Anna, who took a break from her responsibilities at Tucson High School, the largest high school in Tucson, over 3,000 kids, to be here tonight. Gracias, mijita. Te lo agradezco. We also have a very special guest tonight. And it's truly wonderful to have her here with us. I hit the wrong button. Predictable. Bear with me a second. I only use Macs and I have a PC here in front of me. Thank you. The special guest is Ms. Sylvia Mendez, who's here representing the Mendez family. Sylvia, where are you? Sylvia is the daughter of this handsome couple behind me, Gonzalo and Felicita Mendez. You'll learn much more about him in a few minutes. I'm grateful, Sylvia, that you made the trip. I dedicate this presentation to your family, to your parents, and to all families everywhere who work, often under very difficult circumstances, to establish equality in education for all students. As I started preparing this presentation and reviewing articles about the Brown decision, I came across some recent articles about an older but noteworthy case as Mendez versus Westminster. Reminiscent of the rejection of Reverend Oliver Brown's daughter, Linda, from the Sumner Elementary School in Topeka, Kansas, an action that precipitated the Brown case, Gonzalo and Felicita Mendez from Westminster, California, initiated their lawsuit when school officials denied their children enrollment in a local school. The school officials deemed the children, Sylvia, Jeronimo, and Gonzalo Jr., as being too dark-skinned and with a Spanish surname, undesirable characteristics sufficient to bar them from attending school there. The successful class action lawsuit subsequently filed by Mr. Mendez and his family, along with 4 other families, on behalf of thousands of Mexican-American students segregated in schools in Orange County, California, should be considered, as Juan Perea has suggested, an important part of the intellectual history of the landmark Brown decision, which we commemorate through these annual AERA gatherings. When U.S. District Judge Paul McCormick, after deliberating for almost a year, ruled that the segregation of Mexican-American students indeed violated not only state law, but also the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the Mendez case became, according to Richard Valencia, the first successful constitutional challenge to segregation. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals subsequently affirmed the Mendez decision. This ruling, however, was not decided on the federal Constitution, specifically the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. Rather, it was based on state law, which allowed the segregation of Asian and Native American kids, but did not specify the segregation of Mexican children, and for that matter, African American children. In so doing, as Ariola has pointed out, the Court of Appeals ruling strategically sidestepped the issue of racial discrimination, hence becoming insufficient to overturn a significant corpus of segregation precedent, including Plessy. Furthermore, the Mendez case was never appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and therefore did not challenge directly the High Court's 1896 ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, sanctioning racial segregation, the reversal of which, of course, we celebrate tonight. That was a great achievement of the Brown case. Nevertheless, as proposed by several authors, there are at least 4 factors that intertwine Mendez and Brown. Let me take a minute to review them. First, as was also the central strategy in the Brown case 7 years later, the main theme of this AERA commemoration of Brown, the lead attorney in the Mendez case, a lawyer from LA named David C. Marcus, more on Mr. Marcus in a second, used social science research testimony in support of the argument about the harmful effects of segregation on the development of Mexican American children. 2 experts testified in 1946. Ralph Beals, chair of the Department of Anthro and Sociology at Stanford, and Mary Hughes, a former principal working for LA County Public Schools and a PhD student also at Stanford. Two main themes prevailed in the work, in their testimonies at the case. How segregation fosters harmful feelings of inferiority and rejection in the children, and how isolation delays acculturation and English language learning. It is easy to detect the similarity of these, or the first of these, to the celebrated Brown social science testimony. However, I want to underscore the second theme because it mentions two primary goals of segregated schooling for Mexican American children: Americanization or assimilation and learning of English, both usually accomplished at the expense of academic learning and development, I'm afraid. These remain contentious issues of educational policy and practice over half a century later, especially in the restrictive language policies characteristic of the education of English language learners in states, I'm sorry to say, like California and Arizona. A second point of connection with the Brown case, as Valencia writes, is that in ruling in favor of school segregation, Judge McCormick, and here's a nice photo of Judge McCormick, took an indirect swipe at Plessy. In rejecting the argument of separate but equal schools, Judge McCormick, foreshadowing the Brown decision, wrote as follows in 1946. The equal protection of the laws pertaining to the public school system in California is not provided by furnishing in separate schools the same technical facilities, textbooks, and courses of instruction to students of Mexican ancestry that are available to the other public school children regardless of ancestry. A paramount requisite of the American system of public education is equality. It must be open to all children by unified school association regardless of lineage. This is 1946. This powerful language would echo later in the Brown decision. As Aguirre has written, Warren's forceful yet easily understood ruling in Brown mirrored the language and sentiment of McCormick's decision in Mendez. Third point. In the subsequent appeal of this ruling by the school districts, several organizations submitted amicus briefs in support of the school children in the Mendez case. Among them, the ACLU, the American Jewish Congress, the Japanese American Citizens League, and the NAACP. The NAACP brief, prepared by no less than Robert Carter, Thurgood Marshall, and Loren Miller, three legendary names, no? Argued that segregation per se must be considered unconstitutional. Marshall, Carter, and Miller, I'm sure you recall, later served as counsel for the plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education. In fact, it was Carter who authored the Brown argument and who readily acknowledges that their amicus brief for Mendez served later as a model for Brown. In an earlier case in California, in 1931, an important case, a county court in Lemon Grove ruled that the local school district could not prevent admission of Mexican American students based on state law. At that time, in 1931, the legislature refused to pass a bill that would have prohibited such discrimination. The Mendez victory, however, urged the California legislators to find the political will to finally repeal the statute. So in June of 1947, 2 months after the Ninth Circuit Court upheld the outcome of the district court, thus affirming Judge McCormick's decision in Mendez, the governor of California, Earl Warren, signed the bill into law repealing segregation. And yes, this is the same Earl Warren who, as Chief Justice, would author the celebrated unanimous Supreme Court opinion of Brown. As Arreola has written, Mendez signaled the end of widespread de jure segregation of Chicanos throughout the Southwest. But as Oldfield has amply documented, the battle over de facto segregation, which one could argue started in the Southwest with the Mendes decision, is still very much in progress. Latinos are often, as Patricia Gándara writes, triply segregated by ethnicity, by poverty, and by language. For present purposes, however, there's another aspect of this Mendes case, in addition to pointing out the lineage between the cases, that I want to elaborate briefly, what I'm calling its cultural and intellectual geography. Court cases, like educational practices, I think, must always be understood in context. This discussion will also serve as a transition to what I want to emphasize in the second part of this talk, the topic of mobilizing resources and knowledge to challenge the stultifying uniformity and regimentation of much contemporary schooling. Throughout much of the 20th century, as everyone here knows, segregation was a dominant social policy of how one could lead one's life, regardless of where one lived in the U.S. In the mid-1940s, schools in California were no exception. They remain, as they have been for decades, segregated institutions. However, California did not have a state law that required separate schools for Mexican-American children, as I have mentioned. The only groups that could be segregated by state law were Native Americans and Asians. However, in the case of Mexican-American children, school districts justified segregation, citing the necessity for their special needs, which range from claims about their poor hygiene and contagious diseases to innate limitations and cultural inferiority, for which Americanization was the answer. Gilbert Gonzalez, the historian, explains as follows the dominant perception of Mexican culture in that historical period. The culture of the Mexican community was defined as a cause of a tangle of pathologies, he writes, that were alleged to plague it. It was believed that nothing could be gained until there was a transformation, either coerced or voluntary, from Mexican cultural standards to American standards. Nothing appeared to indicate that segregated schooling required modification, and it remained a prescription of choice for remedying Mexican culture. The testimony of the school district superintendents in the Mendes case, which can only be described as a discourse of stereotypes and denigration, is consistent with his ideology. They argue forcefully that Mexican inferiority in all aspects of life warranted segregation from white children. One of the superintendents even claimed that Mexican children were handicapped in their interpretation of English words because their cultural background prevented them from learning Mother Goose rhymes. Give me a break. With these perceptions as justification, the overall schooling experience of Mexican-American children, as summarized by several authors, Valencia, Ruiz, Gonzalez, among others, were characterized by the following: a strong reliance on IQ testing that categorized them as intellectually inept. 2, tracking into industrial and other non-academic forms of instruction. 3, coercive Americanization practices, including the imposition of English only and the punitive subordination of Spanish. And 4, general negative perceptions about their culture, motivation, and educability. That's a hard word to pronounce with a Spanish accent. This is what critical race theories would call educational practice for the protection of white privilege, with the goal of benefiting the more property counterparts, the wealthier kids, while denying communities of color opportunities for asset accumulation and upward mobility. I'm sure you notice the continuities of these subtractive educational practices as found in the abuses of testing and the accompanying regimentation and reductionist curricula supported by current educational policies. But let me return to the story. The school board in Orange County routinely rejected Mexican-American parental protests about segregated schooling and requested that their children, rather than be forced to attend segregated schools, be allowed to attend schools with ample resources rather than dilapidated ones. The Mexican origin population, which had grown rapidly because of immigration, despite forced deportations a decade or so earlier, was far from homogeneous. It featured then, as it does now, what Vicky Ruiz calls, the historian calls, a layering of generations. The combination of recent arrivals with generations of U.S.-born citizens. Gonzalez makes the important point that in the mid-1940s, the education boards were now dealing with second-generation Mexican Americans, U.S. citizens, including returning veterans of the Second World War who were well aware of their rights and the harm produced by segregation. The Mendez family could well be described as second-generation Latinos. Gonzalo Mendez was born on January 10, 1913 in Chihuahua, Mexico. Chihuahua is about 200 miles south of El Paso, Texas. He came to California with his mother when he was 5 years old and was raised in Westminster in Orange County and attended school there until the 5th grade. Ironically, the same school that would years later reject his children. An excellent student, economic circumstances forced him to leave school and go work in the agricultural fields, later becoming a tenant farmer, which is a key aspect of this narrative, as I'll explain. He also became a naturalized citizen, studying the Constitution in the process, and was fluent and literate in English as well as in Spanish. By all accounts, Mr. Mendez was a bright, charismatic, and savvy about U.S. ways, what his daughter Sylvia refers to as acculturated. His wife, Felicita Mendez, known as Fela, was born in Juncos, Puerto Rico, about 25 miles southeast of San Juan, for those of you that don't know the island, where I'm from, on February 1916. Hence, she was a U.S. citizen. Fela and her parents, two brothers and a sister, migrated to Arizona in 1926 to work in cotton farms as part of an early Puerto Rican diaspora. About 1,500 made the trek from Puerto Rico, attracted by promises of good wages, sanitary working conditions, and adequate housing. They sent recruiters from Arizona to Puerto Rico to recruit and bring the workers to the desert. Of course, upon arrival in Arizona, the Puerto Rican farm workers discovered that the realities were quite different and that they had been deceived. They were outraged about being paid a sum below specified in the contract and the terrible working and living conditions, and they took action. They left the farms to protest in weeks, seeking assistance from the Arizona Federation of Labor, which helped feed them to prevent starvation. But otherwise, according to McCormick and Ayala, did little to assist them, considering them outsiders, despite their U.S. citizenship, who were not part of organized labor. Without further assistance from local or national labor organizations, these workers, with few resources of their own, soon dispersed and left Arizona. Among those who migrated to California in search of better conditions was Fela's family. She was 12 years old. Her father, Felipe, initially found work in the railroad, and the family settled within local Mexican communities and would later move to Westminster, where he would work with Gonzalo, his future son-in-law. Felicita or Fela would meet and marry Gonzalo in 1935. Is that right, Sylvia? 1935. And started a small restaurant or cafe in the Mexican barrio Santa Ana that earned them a good living, including gaining property assets. And they had 3 children, including our honored guest. Around 1943, acting on the advice of his banker and family friend, Mr. Monroe, the Mendez family would lease land, 40 acres, from a Japanese-American family, the Munemitsus, who had been consigned to an internment camp in Arizona. The Mendezes, who employed 30 workers, cultivated and sold vegetables in what became a prosperous business during the war years that would come to subsidize the Mendez case. When the Munemitsus returned, the Mendez family returned their property to them. Living at the farm placed them in the broader neighborhood of Gonzalo's old school, Westminster School, which school officials had by then designated as a white school only, and which would reject his kids. The refusal of the school to enroll the kids shocked the family. They tried to negotiate with school officials, appealing to the principal and school board, but to no avail. The school would eventually offer to make an exception and accept the Mendez children, but no other Mexican kids, an arrangement which the family refused. The family started considering suing the school district. Mr. Mendez requested assistance from a Hispanic civic organization which refused to help him, although they would later contribute to the appeal. Sylvia Mendez recalls that her father arrived at home dismayed, deeply disappointed about the organization's refusal to assist them, but that her mother said, "We'll do it ourselves. We have the money to pay for a lawyer." A wise Latina. This was a historical decision, a moment that would change the future education for thousands of kids. By then, the family farm had become prosperous, to the extent that they had even leased additional acres from another farmer. Therefore, the Mendez family exercised leadership in the lawsuit, but was also not as vulnerable economically as other families in the barrios. They were willing and able to take on the financial responsibility for the lawsuit, even remunerating for lost wages people who were asked to attend or testify in court. In fact, Mr. Mendez himself dedicated fully a year to the case, in the process educating himself about the law, while his wife minded the farm business and organized a group of Mexican-American parents in support of the case. As Gonzalez wrote, Gonzalo Mendez practically became Attorney Marcus's assistant, driving him throughout the county to gather evidence and supportive data and to interview individuals. I think you get a sense of what type of family this is, right? You don't mess with the Mendez family. A friend of the family had referred them to attorney David C. Marcus, an unsung hero in this whole story, I think. He was already well known for having won a class action lawsuit. I think I fell behind a little bit in the slides. This is a slide on the summarizing the conditions of the lawsuit. The figure is on the number of white kids in Westminster Elementary, and in the darker color is the number of Mexican-American kids. So there are 628 white kids and 14 Mexican-American kids. In the school next door, Hoover Elementary, not even, as I read, 100 yards away, there were 152 kids, all Mexican kids, and no white kids. Here we go, Mr. Marcus. Mr. Marcus was already well known for having won a class action lawsuit for a group of Mexican and Puerto Rican children who were being denied use of a public school, of a public park and pool. Common forms of discrimination, as you know. As an initial strategy, this is a nice photo of Mr. Marcus. As an initial strategy, Marcus suggested expanding the number of participants in the lawsuit, involving other neighborhoods and schools, to show that segregation of children was systemic and widespread. That is how the other children, how the other families already mentioned joined the Mendez family in suing Westminster in March of 1945 on behalf of the children. The judge ruled in their favor And the Ninth Circuit of Appeals in San Francisco affirmed unanimously that ruling on April of 1947. And thus, so did Gonzalo and Felicita Mendez, a Mexican and a Puerto Rican, immigrants, bilinguals and U.S. citizens, parents and community members, agricultural laborers, business owners, and tenant farmers, and champions of children, with the help of neighbors, institutions, and organizations representing different races and ethnicity, helped change the history of education in this country. It was the beginning of the end of mandated racially segregated schools in California and elsewhere. A process of change that will become national in scope and ratified legally through the Brown case. Mendez and Brown have become part of our cultural legacy, one could say, and their achievements still inspire all of those working for equity in education. The essence of Mendez and Brown, then, is the inextricability of education and social justice. All educational decisions involving as they do relations of power and involving as they do treatments of differences have consequences for issues of equity and social justice. The Mendez and Brown families pursued their lawsuits not simply to integrate their children into schools with white children. Their intent, I believe, which was much broader than that, to secure for their children, and by implication for thousands of other children, the same ample educational resources and opportunities routinely provided to advantaged white kids. Lest we forget, however, we're now in the middle of enormous social and cultural transformation in education, brought about by the changing demographics. It would have been difficult, I think, for the participants in the Mendez and Brown cases to foresee that their children, that the children they defended, still considered minorities in the field of education, still in great part segregated, still in great part poor, and still categorized as insufficient and sorted through the injudicious application of standardized tests, would in a few decades become the new majority in schools throughout the country. But they are. This slide, we included it because the demographic changes in education are often assumed to be solely an urban phenomenon. But as some of these data indicate, the phenomenon is also part of suburban education. And segregated schools in suburban areas are plentiful. I finished that section with a quote from Warren Simmons from the Annenberg Institute of Educational Reform at Brown University, in which he, and as a preview of the argument that I'm now going to make, in which he argues that community-centered educational reform, with emphasis on engagement, on equity and academic development, can provide the capital required to counter forces that derail and delay the succession of reforms tried since Brown versus the Board. I would therefore add an important corollary to the implications of Mendez and Brown, what Abu El-Haj refers to as meaningful or substantive inclusion. For so-called minority children, especially in the contemporary social context, these educational resources and opportunities must include integrating their language and cultural experience into the social and intellectual fabric of schools, much like it is always seamlessly integrated into the education of privileged white kids. In education, power is transmitted through these social relations, representations, and practices, which determine whose language and cultural experiences count and whose do not, and which students are at the center, and therefore which students must remain in the periphery. As Bourdieu has suggested, the power to make groups is political power par excellence. Consequently, as Ball and Alim have written, it we are to realize the full potential of Brown, and I would add Mendes, we must continue to disrupt the instructional status quo by aggressively pursuing actions that strive to support schools in their efforts to become more sensitive and responsive to the needs of diverse student populations. However, our ways of thinking about differences structure these possibilities for action in education. In what follows, I want to present some ideas, as briefly as I can, for pedagogical action based on a particular resource-based conceptualization of differences. This conceptualization, as I'll explain, underscores the pedagogical value of the language and cultural resources of the children and families with whom we work. To be sure, resources are always accompanied by vulnerabilities, especially in economically poor communities. But it's the perception of the availability of ample resources, especially by teachers and students, which shapes the possibilities for action. I will argue that by identifying and mobilizing social-cultural resources, by making them visible for pedagogical appropriation, one can challenge entrenched institutional norms and practices that exclude them, that segregate them, if you will, disallowing an asset-driven approach to diversity. How then can we start producing new approaches that build on rather than resist the vibrancy of the demographic changes in society? For several years, I've been interested in a particular framing of education, a social-cultural framing based on a combination of educational anthropology with an emphasis on understanding cultural practices by doing studies in situ, which I consider the most empirical of methods, and a Vygotskian cultural historical psychology with its emphasis on how such practices mediate the development of thinking. Central to this work has been the move away from normative models of culture toward a more grounded understanding of culture as practice or as lived experiences. That is, rather than focusing on cultural norms and how people live by these norms as part of a shared and cohesive culture, we focus instead on the variability of practices, how people live culturally within their concrete social circumstances. This combination of a particular kind of anthropology with a particular kind of psychology enables what Val Sinner calls careful contact with phenomena, to understand how human beings use social processes and cultural resources of all kinds in mediating learning and development. Our research then, conducted in collaboration with classroom teachers and involving working class populations, particularly Latino students and families, has to do with identifying and mobilizing knowledge and other resources found in households and other settings, which we refer to in our work as funds of knowledge. The approach has two main purposes, perhaps many other purposes, but two main purposes I want to emphasize tonight. How educators come to depict for themselves and from their work the families and children with whom they work, what I call the politics of representation, how they represent those families for others. I'm borrowing that term from Hallquist. Our work has featured teachers generating first-hand knowledge through ethnographic-like visits to families and kids, to challenge predominant deficit-oriented discourses about minority families, and to give teachers an opportunity to establish familiarity and relations of trust with the families. In addition, our studies have documented that immigrant as well as other types of households are generally characterized by a broad variety of experiences and skills that life has given them. As a feature of daily life, there is mobility to these funds of knowledge. In fact, the metaphor of funds in funds of knowledge refers to how this knowledge is often bartered through social networks with other households, in essence becoming the currency or capital for these exchanges, thus an important aspect of the household economy. The mobility of knowledge facilitates producing networks of exchange predicated on establishing relations of trust between families and teachers for developing educational capital. Another point, and let me abbreviate, is not simply to make funds and knowledge available, but to create social spaces, discourse spaces, for teachers to think with each other about the work that they're doing. That professional development is central to changing schooling practices to address the diversity of students with us. Our view then, teachers who develop genuine relationships with their students have a significant impact on students' academic orientation and success. Sonia Nieto, for example, expands the notion of highly qualified teacher, about time, beyond acquiring subject matter knowledge, teaching and management skills, or passing the test, or certification exam, to include the formation or relations of trust with students. Those types of trusting relationships may be established in a variety of ways, but it generally includes teachers respecting and taking an interest in the students and their particular experiences, and connecting their teaching to those lived experiences while establishing high expectations for academic learning. Mobilizing languages. Let me summarize this point rather than refer to the text. Here, I'm interested in responses to the encapsulation of schooling by restrictive language policy, what my colleague Richard Ruiz proposes as a language as a resource orientation. And I'm advocating for the development, in the studies that we've done, for the development of biliteracy in children. Later, I will show you, summarize a school that facilitates, that enables kids to become literate in English and Spanish by the end of elementary school. Every child in the school, regardless of ethnicity, of race, of socioeconomic background, or first language, become literate in 2 language systems. I propose that if the school is not helping your children, I would propose to families that if the school is not helping your children become literate in at least 2 language systems, then the school is serving other people's needs, but not the needs of your kids. Okay? And there's a section in the paper that I want to skip over, which has to do with some of the documentation of the power of fluent bilingualism and in the development of students, in particular, in how fluent bilingualism, I'm borrowing from the work of Portes and Rumbaud here, how fluent bilingualism facilitates relations with the families in ways that the families can keep tab on the students' progress, particularly vigilant about social relationships that they develop, and monitor the students. Mobilizing practices. A key point then in developing a pedagogy that will mediate the constraints of the system currently in place is to develop the sort of networks located among peers, families, teachers, and ethnic community that may provide social and cultural resources to support academic development in schools. These are what Warren Simmons calls smart education systems, which foster relationships to the settings in and around them and develop community within schools, among schools, and in relationship to their neighborhood and cities they rely on to support students' learning and development. Fortunately, I think that there are many institutional and instructional strategies that can facilitate higher achievement in African American and Latino kids, many precisely because the relationship they foster, precisely because of the relationships they foster. I want to describe 4 settings very quickly that illustrate the idea of mobilizing practices by creating smart education systems. And there are 2 common threads to these examples. One is the enormous respect shown by these settings, by these schools, to the students' intellect, expecting rigorous academic performance. And second is the assistance they provide the students in meeting those performances. So let me turn to the examples. All are quite different arrangements for learning, and all are successful, which helps envision alternative possibilities for how schools as social-cultural institutions could function. I start with the dual language school mentioned earlier, which exemplifies the language as a resource perspective, in which all kids, regardless of ethnicity, gender, or economic status, graduate fluent and literate in 2 languages. That's the primary goal of the school, and it is accomplished and monitored carefully for every child. The next school is located in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, with mainly Puerto Rican students, and called the El Puente Academy for Peace and Justice. A central emphasis of the school is to contribute to both the students and their community's development. As Rivera and Pedraza have pointed out, by incorporating students' realities and communities into the curriculum, whether they are, for example, concerns about health, housing, or the environment, and by providing students a creative, critical perspective as tools of inquiry about such issues, schools can emerge as cultural spaces that support both personal and intellectual growth and community development. Particularly attractive about El Puente is the integration of the visual and performing arts as an essential part of their pedagogy. Rivera and Pedraza report that one arts-rich project focused on garment workers in factories in New York, connecting the curriculum to the history of the local Puerto Rican community. A team of artists, teachers, and community organizers explore the world of fashion with the students from a social, cultural, economic, and political perspective. The students researched working conditions in collaborations with the labor union, interviewed factory workers and some of their family members, met with student workers from the Dominican Republic, and studied child labor in other countries. All this work culminated in multi-arts performances to communicate their knowledge to the public, including an arts exhibition in a local gallery. Hence the integration, pedagogy, community needs, and social action is built into the structure of learning in the school. A different example comes from San Diego, California, and the Preuss School. Cecil Lytle and Bud Meehan, Hugh Meehan, Bud is his nickname, both professors at University of California, San Diego, spearheaded this charter school, located on their campus as an effort to prepare and recruit underrepresented students to the university. An interesting characteristic of the school is that it is only available to students whose parents have not graduated from college, hence guaranteeing a mostly low-income student body in the school, in which students are 60% Latino and 13% African American. It is also a remedy for the faculty not to take over the school, right? So as to prevent the faculty brats from taking over the school. The 2 aspects of the school I want to highlight are its high academic expectations. It is a single-track college prep school, and the social and academic support provided students to meet the academic challenge. A key resource of support is the tutoring provided by the university students. As Meehan points out, in addition to assisting students with their academic work, and there are hundreds of undergraduates who help tutor the students, they serve as role models for the students they tutor. Every opportunity is used for providing academic support, whether prior to school, between school, after school, and on Saturdays. As such, and given the parents' lack of college knowledge, college experience, the school's counselors guide the college application process, including writing college essays, understanding the application process and differences among colleges and universities, which is a regular part of the student's course of study and developed early in their careers. I should add, and this is an attempt, of course, to facilitate the development of cultural capital, where none may exist. I should add that at least 2 efforts have been inspired by the success of the Preuss School. One in San Diego, within the public school system, and the other in Tucson, Arizona, as part of a school that we call the Wildcat School, affiliated with our College of Education. Both represent works in progress, with important variations from Preuss, but in both, there are already signs of academic success, with students usually considered at risk of failing. The final example I want to present comes from the work of my colleague Julio Camarota and his colleagues in Tucson. This effort, called the Social Justice Education Project, consists of engaging students in participatory action research as part of social science and history courses in 5 different high schools. In ways reminiscent of El Puente in New York, the students' social milieu, including neighborhoods, schools, peers, and workplaces, become settings for study and critical analysis, as the students engage in research, especially in ethnographic-like inquiry on issues of equity in the communities and schools. A primary characteristic of this program is the explicit embrace of students' home cultures and their intellectual capacities to bring about social change in schools and communities. There are 2 aspects that I want to highlight. One is how students come to use multiple modalities to explore, research, and communicate their insights and learning, ranging from group discussions to poetry to video productions. These become, in essence, tools for thinking about issues that matter to the students. A second aspect is how students inform school administrators and their families about the findings of their studies. As Chiara Canella, one of our recently graduated the doctoral student, observed, there's an important shift in students' confidence in reporting the findings of their inquiries. They are not communicating information they've heard elsewhere or read elsewhere, or somebody else's conclusions. Instead, having conducted their own research and made their own conclusions, underlies student confidence in their presentations and forms the basis for their developing identities as public intellectuals, addressing issues of importance to them, their schools, their families, and their communities. One coda regarding this project: several of the students are now interested in becoming teachers, and a local school district has expressed interest in funding their studies in exchange for them working in school districts within their communities upon completion of the studies. On the other hand, some state officials are insistent in dismantling the program. I guess the fear, the power of public intellectuals and educated youth. Okay? The case of Mendes and Westminster, with which I started this talk, was sustained because, among other factors, the inter-ethnic collaboration among several organizations and participants in whose interest it was to produce cultural change. Of course, the same occurred in the Brown case. These collaborators mobilized knowledge and resources of different types in supporting a common cause, the desegregation of schools. You might recall that I mentioned that in a belated effort to appease the Mendes family, school officials offered to make an exception and admit their children. It would have been easy enough to capitulate. After all, that is what had motivated their actions, to have their kids attend that school. But the Mendes family rejected the offer that would accommodate their children, but deny admission to who knows how many other children, and proceeded with their legal action, at risk. Felicita Mendes, the children's mother, explained it plainly many years later in a newspaper interview. She said as follows of that commitment to proceed: "Our children, She said, all of our children, brown, black, and white, bronceados, negros y blancos, in her words in Spanish, must have the opportunity to be whatever they want to be. And education gives them that opportunity. That's the motivation. The most enduring legacy of Méndez then may not necessarily be the legal victories, as significant as those were, but in what I'm calling today, the Méndez commitment. That noble commitment of Mr. and Mrs. Méndez to educational equity for all children. That commitment to have schools treat all children with dignity and respect, and have schools accommodate to their realities as much as the children are asked to accommodate to the realities of their schooling. And that Méndez commitment to create inter-ethnic alliances in advocating for the rights of children and their families. This commitment is continued today by Sylvia Méndez in her efforts to educate a new generation of students to the spirit and the lessons of the case, and to the continued pursuit of equity in education. This, by the way, is going to be the new Felicita and Gonzalo Méndez Learning Center in LA. It's the second such setting. A nice tribute to these educators, to these families. I want to conclude by quoting from a recent column by Ellis Coase in Newsweek, Ellis Coase, the Newsweek editor and columnist, on the nomination of Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. He writes about how Sotomayor's story is compelling, and that every chapter is worthy of Hollywood. And about that when she was through with the tendentious questioning, which she underwent, although in great pain because of an ill-fitting cast on her ankle, something not revealed until much later. And after the final confirmation by the Senate, she celebrated with friends and family who had supported them, who had supported her. Ellis Coase then writes as follows. But there's also a story beyond Sotomayor, one that helps explain why her appointment elicited such excitement. That story has to do with the state of American politics and the role that Latinos play in it. Even before her nomination, various groups, including Hispanic Congressional Caucus chaired by New York Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, approached influentials inside and outside the White House, arguing that it was time to name a Hispanic to the court. And once Sotomayor was tapped, those same groups engaged in what was essentially a full-time effort to counter the inedible criticisms that came her way. In the process, they forged a new coalition, not just among Latinos, but African Americans, Asians, and liberal whites, that aspires to become a new political force. Indeed, there is power to those alliances, difficult as they are to create, and even more difficult to sustain. They are what made both Brown and Méndez a reality, and what made possible the examples of schooling that I highlighted as well. And it is by living the Méndez commitment, by developing and mobilizing resources and people of all kinds, that we might finally be able to have an educational system that, guided by the principle of equity and grounded in our communities, is accountable to serving the needs of all of our children. Thank you, colleagues, for listening so patiently. Thank you. Thank you. Gracias. Thank you, I appreciate it. These are the kids, by the way, celebrating the issuing of a stamp, commemorating the Méndez decision. Gracias.
Stay. I want to thank Luis for this very informative and inspiring talk that affirms for us through our history, through the work of Sylvia Mendez's family and herself, that indeed, through struggle and commitment, we can indeed make a change. There will be a book in the reception area that you can sign and leave a commemorative note for Luis, which we hope you will sign that. The lecture will be on the AERA website, and it also will be published sometime soon in Educational Researcher, so that you'll be able to continue to share this important message from Luis. And we have a wonderful reception in the hall. We'd like you to eat, drink, be merry, and we will see you again next year, same time, same place. Thank you.